If you ever feel out of control around food, you're not alone, and you're in the right place to learn practical, no-nonsense information about why you binge and how to stop. Binge eating does not mean that something is wrong with you. It's a natural but primitive brain response that you can correct. If you're ready for change, sign up for the Brain Over Binge self-paced online course for less than $20 per month. And if you feel you need personalized support, we also offer one-on-one coaching and group coaching. To learn more, go to brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. I'm Kathryn Hansen, your host, and I'm happy to be here today for another Recovery Stories episode. This is actually the final Recovery Stories episode, at least for now. I would really love to do this again in the future because it's been amazing connecting with everyone who has shared, and I know that the more people who share their story, the better chance we have to reach everyone who is suffering with food issues. Today's show has 4 guests: Aya, Moira, Caroline, and Samantha. This is the longest Recovery Stories episode I've had, so I'm going to get right into it, and then I'll be back at the end of the show with a few additional things to share. So today we have Aya, and I'm very happy to have you today to share your story.
Hi.
We're just going to talk about your journey and what makes you unique in the people who shared their story in the Brain Over Binge second edition is you really didn't have bulimia itself. You struggled with more disordered eating, body image issues, and dieting. So, when did all that start for you?
It started in a very early age. I grew up in a kibbutz in Israel back in the 80s. I was born in 1977. I'm like 45. And kibbutz is a small community. And we used to sleep in a classroom. And the parents were not there. I was like 5. And we all sleep there. All the kids slept there. So it's not like unusual. It's just the way people live back then. But my mother, we are 6 children, and each child was in different class, okay? And that was the kibbutz back then, and you can read about it if you're more interested in that form of life. Anyway, so she used to go to the club, the kibbutz, where all the parents used to go at 9 p.m., to drink tea and to talk about other people. That's what people did. And she always promised me that she will bring back with a glass of cookies from that club, social club. And I used to wait for her. I don't know, wait maybe half an hour, maybe 1 hour, maybe 5 minutes. And in the morning, she always put like a glass of plain cookies, like waffles or bagels or, And I think it's more now that I rethinking about it. It's emotional feeling. But then I grew up because in the kibbutz, everything was free. Food was free. Lots of food in the morning, in the evening. I wasn't starving. But I think mom and cookies were like the same. Now, when I grew up, as I wrote to you, I used to go to school, which was we need to take a bus, like school bus. And I used to go with no sandwiches, nothing, maybe 2 cucumbers. I don't know why, it just didn't. So I think what I'm trying to tell you is that I was playing basketball many years, since I was 7 till I was 18. So I used to play in 2 groups, younger and adults. And sometimes I had 2 practices a day and I was really hungry. And in some point, we just moved and sleep in home. So my parents was not organized to feed us well. So it's like, I think I felt like deprivation, but not intentionally. And it was like very dissonance between the free food in the dining room, in the kibbutz. And you can imagine like everything's free. You can take whatever you want. And my feeling was very alone and I wasn't feeding myself properly. After I grew up, like my body was always hungry, a lot of the time hungry. So I became a vegetarian. In the dining room, there was no variety. And I was hungry. So the same cookies that I remember from age of 5, I used to eat these a lot during afternoon. And by the age of I served the army, of course, in Israel, you have to do that. And after I released from the army, I started to gain weight. And then I started with Weight Watchers when I was around 30. And what I realized through your book, I was hearing your book in audio. When you said that it was all started from dieting, you have like this sentence in the book. When was it all started? It was dieting. And then it was like, ting, 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 ting. Everything is like connect. And I realized that all the years of dieting, first of all, I feel like my body really felt like deprivation and starving, not intentionally. And what I was doing is because it reacts on no food, so it was kind of mix up. Mm-hmm. Now, when I stop everything about, as I wrote to you, like 3 years, I stopped dieting and I started to listen to my body, and the body reacts. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit overweight, and as I told you, is it understood what I'm telling you?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting that you the dieting didn't really come first. I mean, at least it was not intentional. It was the food scarcity, but not because you meant for it to be that way. And it's interesting because it kind of does the same thing to the brain. Your brain is still senses that you're in deprivation.
Exactly. And I think it's the way you told your story and what you told in your story that really moved me, which I understand that it's all got connected, that we have a set point and the body is actually reacting to a very early experience of no food, not intentionally, and everything was like confusing. And I was confusing also without knowing. And the minute I understand that, it was like a revolution, like I discovered something new. And for me, it was good because I always talk about the book as something that's really changing everything. When I understood it, I could go to a different approach for myself.
For sure. And it's interesting you made the connection to your mother and the cookies as well, because that early memory of connecting the cookies with emotion and eating with maybe a soothing, it probably activated that pleasure process in the brain and those reward centers to make you attracted to food. And then that coupled with the deprivation, it just sets you up for overeating, for compulsive eating. So you would say you did engage in compulsive eating and overeating, but not binge eating?
Yes, I didn't have a binge eating. I never anorexia, bulimia. No, but eating without control. Okay. Yes. I was 7 years in Weight Watchers. I was volunteering in a Weight Watchers. I went there every week for 7 years because I was on diet, lifestyle, which is every diet is the same. It's no matter how you call it. It's lifestyle. It's all diets are the same. So for me, no more diets ever, ever, ever. And the amazing thing, it's like the set point of the body. The body talks. The brain, like you say, the high level, the animal brain, everything. It's like, so now I don't have it anymore. I have issues with food, but I can feel the body, what it tells me, what it needs. Now it's maybe to relax. The relationship with myself and with the eating is more close because I'm really curious what it tells me. And I've noticed that I'm dealing with food issues for so many years, and many things happen in the last 2 years. I talk about it very openly. I love talking about it. It's no more hiding. And there's no problem with me. As you say it yourself, it's a very healthy brain and it's very healthy body that just react to very early things and no one's fault. Maybe my mother is more neglected because of many kids. And the kibbutz is, as I told you, it's feeling of one thing and the private feeling is the other thing. And the result was no one has ever asked me when I was 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, what are you eating at school? Do you need anything? Are you okay? you take sandwich to school? Do you eat lunch? Do you need something? No one is like, I grew up by myself, what I understood I should do. And the food was become very, very centered in my life. And now I don't look like I wish to, but there is no shame and there is no, oh, I need to be skin. And the whole body image is changing because of that. Yeah. And everything I see now on TV, on the magazine, we have it's called Leisha for the woman magazine, right? Called Leisha. Mm-hmm. And only women. And now that I see commercial with the slim women, it's funny because most women don't look like that.
It's interesting, like culturally too, because, you know, it's an issue in the US with certain body images, but it's like that in Israel too, it seems, with pressure to look a certain way.
Very, very much. You can imagine. First of all, we imitate the US culture and, you know, Facebook, TV, Instagram, it's everywhere. And maybe it's growing up and just the peaceful mind. And, you know, for example, I run. I love to run. I'm not slim. I run slow, but I love it and always love to do sports. But never was slim. Never. Even in my Weight Watchers years. And now I don't treat myself like I need to be fixed. And that's kind of new. It's not like I accept myself overweight. I don't like it. It's not comfortable. But I don't gain weight every year now. I don't. Mm-hmm. I gain weight after doing all the diets, almost a decades of diets. And no more since then. Okay, so it's like the body understands, okay, there is enough food and you don't need to have a deprivation anymore. So it's more easy here, but I still have the issues. I work in a farm. I'm a social worker and I work in a farm of teenagers. It's just daytime and they go back to their home or to the boarding school or whatever they live. But so we grow vegetables, great vegetables and eggplants and lettuce and tomatoes and everything, melons, whatever. Spinach, I love it. So it's organic. It's from the garden straight to the food. We make our own food. It's really a nice place. Even over there, I can see myself. So it doesn't matter if the plate is full of good food, veggie, like organic food, good food, healthy food, whatever. The brain is always broadcast. Okay, make sure you have enough. Make sure you eat enough. So I'm trying to breathe and feel myself. And
yeah, it seems like you're learning to eat intuitively. You're learning to trust your body. And something you wrote in the your story that you shared in my book was that, you know, you were hungry when you were younger. And then 27 years later, your brain is still broadcasting, I'm hungry, because it's smart, right?
Yes. And when you talked about it, it was like someone nailed exactly what I knew. And for me, it was like, wow, I just found out about it. Revelation. Yeah. The body knows and it's remember everything. Maybe it will always be like this and it's fine. It's fine because even wake up at the age of 40, for me, it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that you're not using your past as a reason to keep going. You notice, okay, I may always have this voice. And I don't think always, you know, I think over time it's going to be deconditioned more and more, but you may always have this tendency or you may always have this conditioning from childhood, but you're not using it as a reason to stay stuck. You're just looking toward your future. You're making changes. You're accepting yourself. You're learning to follow your hunger and fullness. And I just think all that's like really inspiring. One thing I want to mention too is that you said you quit smoking with like a similar method. Can you kind of talk about that and how that was related?
Yes, it's really the same. It's like I've stopped smoking with Ellen Carr system. Okay. Have you ever smoked?
No, I have not, but I've heard of Ellen Carr.
So it's like 6-hour seminars. And so you just smoke, you just stop and you have like a deep feeling in the throat. I need to smoke. It's like tickling and my brain said, I want to smoke, but no cigarettes. Mm-hmm. So after a time, 1 day, 2 days, the voice still say, hey, what about cigarette? I want the nicotine. Bring me nicotine. And you just listen to it. Yeah, right. Haha. Okay. Thank you for sharing. Right. Thank you for sharing. And I don't smoke. So the voice keep, hey. So then I told you, like once in 6 months, 6 years, 2 years. Hey, what about some cigarettes? It's really nice. You drinking beer. What about some cigarettes? Thanks for sharing. And it's talking. No more cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the brain of a binge approach is, and when you are not response to that voice, so no more nicotines.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It's related for sure. I mean, it's different in that we all have to eat, we can just stop smoking, but you have to keep eating. So it's that learning that balance. And when the voice is harmful to you and should be dismissed, and when the voice may be telling you something you should eat, and it's learning to just know when to follow your cravings, when not to. And that's different for everyone. And you're never going to get it perfect.
Exactly. And the thing is that many people, they are comparing food issues to addiction, which is very not true, because it's exactly what you said about it. How you describe it, it's like signals that are maybe we understand it differently, but it's more deep than that, because food is so related to the first experience. When I was 2 weeks in the kibbutz, my mother just returned to work, and I was in a house of babies in the kibbutz. So a kibbutz is really a small place. It's like 3 kilometers square. It's not big. Everyone knows everyone, and she could come to see me at night. But all the feeding, I think from the beginning, was not well. Many other kids my age don't have food issues. They have, I don't know, other issues maybe. But for me, it's the food that really speak out, the big feeling of no one cares. I wasn't neglected, but the feeling was really like no one is seeing me, and to be fed. And now I understand this emotionally because of all the work I do with myself. And the healing is through the feeling, okay? Is really to feel that, to talk about it. Meeting you, I never thought you will respond. I just wanted to write to you. I wrote to you. Thank you for changing my life. The message and the voice that your own story met my own story, and your pain met my pain, and we connect. And for me, it's a big deal for me.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure that people will hear your story on the podcast and connect with that and have insights for their own life and make changes based on the inspiration you're giving them. So, I mean, I really appreciate you being here, and we're going to wrap up in a minute, but I just wanted to know if you could talk about how changing these patterns has changed your life. Like, in what ways is your life better? And then just any final thoughts you have for people who are still in that struggle of disordered eating.
Wow. It's very personal journey. Everyone say it, but my journey is not, you didn't grow up in a kibbutz, and I never been bulimia. And still we meet the food issues. It tells me a story. It tells me something I didn't want to hear for many things. And by listening to that voice, to what it tells me about me, then I can do work with that and to feel complete, and to love myself better, and to treat myself better. I know about patterns, and they tell us something about us that we have to see, and everyone should seek for himself what it means to him.
Well, thank you. That's
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's amazing that you get to live now and take care of yourself and learn to love yourself. You get to live free of this, and that's amazing.
Yes.
All right. Today I'm here with Moira Kasaba, and I'm so happy to have you here to share your recovery story.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I mean, your book and what you teach was such an instrumental part of my recovery. And I've wanted to connect for, gosh knows, like maybe 10 years now. So excited to be here. Yeah.
That's amazing, because the book was 11 years old. I mean, the first book, a little over 11 years now. So like, you were definitely one of the early people who found it, because I just published it on my own. It wasn't even on Amazon until at least a year after I published. So for sure, it's great to have one of my original readers here on the podcast. Maybe just start with saying how your eating disorder started and what was your struggle like?
Yeah. So, if we go all the way back, because I think it has something to do with it. And this was true for me. It might not be true for other people, but I think personalities sometimes, lend themselves to eating disorders. And so I definitely have a type A, addictive, driven Enneagram 3 personality. And that's kind of always been my thing. It's like anything I do, I just kind of go all out with it. So I had that personality leading into it. But the irony is, and I love to share this, is I never thought once or twice about food or my body or diet. I think I probably grew up in the most normal home when it comes to that. My mom never talked about diet. It was just, we loved food in our house. I mean, we were healthy, but it was just something that, how a lot of families kind of get together around drinking. My family just really celebrated with food, but not to an unhealthy. I mean, in a really, really healthy way, I saw that around food. So for a long time when I struggled with my eating disorder, and you and I have talked about this, and I'll get into kind of like all the different things I tried to recover. But so many therapists would like go back to like my childhood. What was it like growing up with your mom and what was her relationship with food? I'm like, completely normal, if there is such a thing. And no, like, a lot of times you'll hear like sexual abuse or trauma or something. And I'm like, no, none of that either. So what in the world happened? And your book was the first time that I was like, yeah, it was literally just kind of triggered in my brain. And what I remember is I did have probably when I was in like 11th or 12th grade. So up to this point, I'd been an athlete, so I didn't really struggle with like extra weight or anything. I just ate for fuel. I'd never thought twice about it. But there was a homecoming dance coming up. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, you know what? I think my sister binges and purges. Like it was like this novel solution, and it was like, we should just do that. So I can remember the experience of me and my girlfriend, probably at 17, like making all this food at my house and just like completely overeating. And then it was like, and then we'll just go get rid of it. Like problem solved. And so that became like almost instantaneously, like there was this homecoming dance. I wanted to be like in this dress. And so I was like, oh, well, that works. And if I just don't really eat anything during the day and I can still eat this giant meal and then just get rid of it, problem solved. And so I dropped weight quick, probably like 10 pounds, maybe fit into the dress. And like all of a sudden that was like an easy fix for any time that I just wanted to binge, And so I had no idea the freight train was like getting ready to smack me in the face and how much that would end up kind of just enslaving me for so many years. And I would say this too, it's like that began the diet, right? Like that was my first diet. That was the first time I restricted food, which you talk a lot about. And so when leading up to this, I never really thought about food, but the second you start restricting and the second I was like, oh, I'll just have a bagel and not eat till dinner, my brain and my body was like, well, now you're programming yourself to like go into this animalistic hunger binge mode. And then you're just, like I said, almost instantaneously in that crazy cycle of, purging in one way or another to get rid of it and then starving yourself and then doing it again. And so, I mean, I would say like I dabbled in that for probably a few years. And then I was probably like 21 and I had actually gotten sober. So I got sober out in California when I was 21. And
from alcohol?
Yep. Alcohol. And so there I was. And again, I really didn't think about food because alcohol had been my drug of choice too, up until that point. But when I put down alcohol, like it came back, right? Like that's when it really came in for me because I'm newly sober. I'm uncomfortable. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to do life without alcohol. In recovery, people eat a ton of sweets because it's normal. It's like, let me smoke a lot of cigarettes or eat a bunch of junk food so I can kind of numb this feeling of like, uncomfortability.
Yeah.
And
It's
so
like those pleasure pathways in the brain. Like you don't have the alcohol fueling that. So you need something else to fuel it.
Yes, absolutely. And so I really quickly put on weight, and then all of a sudden there was a problem, right? Then it was like, how do I get this weight off for the first time in my entire life? And it was like, oh, let me just go back to what I did when I was 17. That worked. And so that's when it really took off. And my life started to, I say, somewhat revolve around it. But again, for me, I read some crazy book called The Carbohydrate Addict's Diet. And it basically taught that if you only eat carbohydrates in like this 1 hour window, like, and there was all this science and everything, I was like, oh, this is the solution. And it was basically saying binge for an hour. And, you know, that's the solution. So I would restrict my food all day. And then I would binge for this 1 hour, purge. And I dropped weight really quick because, again, it was just this one binging episode. And I lived like that for a lot of years, a whole lot of years until, well, I say a whole lot of years. It was probably a couple years into that I was like, I don't think this is healthy. Like the awareness of this is really messed up and I don't want to be doing this and I should get help. So, you know, I went the route of like, I don't even know who you call. Do you call a therapist, a nutritionist? So I kind of went that route. And again, there was this incredible fear of gaining weight, and you're talking to people that can't identify at all with the things you've been through. At least the people that I was, had sought out, they themselves hadn't experienced an eating disorder. So they're kind of looking at you like, but why would you do that? Like it makes you feel crazier. Right. Yeah. And they're like, just eat this nutrition plan. And I'm looking at it like, you want me to eat all that food all day long? Like, terrified out of my mind. And of course I would try it and I would immediately gain weight. So I would abandon it. And then I remember moving to Charleston, South Carolina, and it was kind of like this new life, clean slate. Everything was like, it was a restart for me. So I was like, I am going to tackle this because I'm type A. I get it done. I can fix this, So again, I sought out like a therapist here and had the exact same experience of kind of them looking at me like when I would speak like my truth and like, this is what happens. It's like they couldn't understand it, and it was so defeating and hopeless. And so then I even went the route of like Overeaters Anonymous, but I was willing to do whatever it took to get the help that I so desperately wanted. But every single thing that I sought out, honestly, looking back, fueled the fire for it. It just made it worse. And I've always been super interested in like neuroplasticity and the brain and the ability to rewire habits. And I had started kind of getting into that research a little bit. And I really had kind of this other belief system of what you teach, but I felt like, well, this is crazy. Like my thoughts about how I could solve this, if I would say something to somebody, they would look at me like, that's not going to work, And what I realize now through the coaching and the knowledge that I have is so often the more we focus on, the feelings under it or the behavior patterns, and not even the behavior patterns, but like just the more ammunition I gave my eating disorder and the more attention, the bigger it got, because I was in fact like laying down bricks on the wiring, right? I was building like an even stronger neural pathway to create the behavior again and again and again. And it is the most hopeless, horrible. I mean, everyone that has gone through this like totally gets it, but I know it's really hard to understand if you've never experienced it. And then at one point I somehow, and I think I was probably Googling, right? I came across a coach that's worked specifically with eating disorders, and I think specifically bulimia, Polly Merton. And so I hired her. It was over the phone. And she was the first person that, first of all, told me immediately that I needed to go get your book.
She was one of the first people who ever kind of interviewed me and found my book. So it's so interesting that you found her. Yeah.
And that's what ultimately set me free. And I think, it was her coaching alongside. So, I would read the book and I would implement, and I would have these experiences of like, just complete freedom. And I'm like, it can't be this easy, and our wiring, we always fall back to, right? But I was able to reach out. And so she was really able, and I know you offer coaching too, and I think it's just invaluable. She was able to kind of right my brain every week, and like just somebody to check my thoughts with. And it's a relearning, right? It's like a complete relearning of everything that you've ever done. And this is important too, because I think for a while in that stretch, there was complete freedom in comparison, but I was still falling into kind of, the diet behaviors. I don't even want to say diet behaviors. I wasn't restricting, I wasn't binging, but I still kind of had like messed up thoughts about like good foods, bad foods, that kind of thing, eating clean and then going off the wagon and that kind of stuff. So that's when I ended up finding a nutrition plan. And I'm a big believer in like a nutrition plan is going to absolutely work for some people at their stage of recovery where they are. And it could absolutely be the worst thing for somebody else. It's different for everybody. But I found this nutrition plan from a like fitness nutrition person. And I think it was because she was the expert and she was, fit and in really good shape. I trusted that. And I was like, all right, I'm going to trust her. And I think what was so important was it was a balanced nutrition plan. There were absolutely enough calories. You're eating fruit, you're eating carbohydrates, you're eating everything. And so, I was able to stop demonizing certain foods. I started to believe because I followed this nutrition plan and I felt really good and I didn't have these crazy cravings that I was allowed to eat carbohydrates, that I was allowed to eat treats, that I was allowed to eat fruit. I used to think like I can't eat fruit, like all those crazy things. So a lot of those food rules fell away when I found that nutrition plan. So that was kind of the final catalyst over the hump.
Yeah, to make sure that you're eating enough and to have that structure. And like you said, some people may need that structure. And for other people, it ends up feeling too restrictive or like a diet. But you needed that permission. Like, hey, you're allowed to eat all day. You don't have to just eat in this 1 hour window where,
right.
All of that is super helpful. I love how you use like the 17-year-old voice. Oh, I'll just try this. What could it hurt?
Right.
Right. And I think so many people can relate to that because so many people fall into it very innocently.
Yes.
They hear something someone else is doing. They hear some diet advice. They hear, oh, this is going to work. Before you know it, like you said, it's like a freight train hitting you in the face and then you're stuck in it and it causes so many problems. So just to be able to get yourself out of that, to get the coaching you needed, to get the help you needed to rewire those habits. So how long have you been, free of the issue?
About 10 years. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That was about 10 years ago. Yeah.
That's amazing.
And like you said, I think, mine was this crazy thought of like, oh, let's try this, binging and purging. Like it sounds insane. But I think it so innocently starts with like, just don't eat carbohydrates or you shouldn't have fruit, like things that truly seem innocent that somebody's saying, this works for me. And then you innocently adopt that. But what you're doing is you're restricting an entire food group that your body needs. And that's so often how it starts.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing that really resonated with me was when you talked about being that type A personality and thinking, okay, I'm going to fix this, and then seeking all the help that you could get because that's what you're supposed to do. And I think a lot of people with eating disorders are those driven people, those very determined, and I'm going to get the help I need. And you go get that help and suddenly it's just so confusing. And you feel like, okay, I have to fix my emotions and look at my past. And you're doing all the things you think you need to be doing, but it feels like you're on a hamster wheel basically and not getting anywhere.
Yeah. And in fact, I was getting worse, because I was just focusing too much on it. And I didn't mention this, but through that process too, I tried, and we don't use the word diets anymore, right? Because we're like somewhere intellectually, we know diets are bad, but eating paleo or raw or all these different modalities and these like nutrition philosophies in some way. And again, I'm not just some people that totally works for them and they don't have any eating disorder behavior and that's great. But for me, every time I grabbed onto like, oh, I'm going to eat this way and this is going to solve all my problems, and free me from this. It was just another version of restriction on some level and a set of really hard black and white rules that, spun me out even more because I was not allowing a certain thing in my diet. And I think that's so important too. I remember one of my friends saying, talking about kind of having this nutrition plan in recovery. And she said, because I remember going to her and saying, I'm terrified to try this, the nutrition plan that helped me so much. And I was like, I'm terrified because I'm kind of like 85% into recovery, right? But like, I know I need that extra little bit. And I was so scared because I thought it was going to throw me all the way back. And she said, why don't you just look at it as a framework for freedom? Like, you don't have to do it perfect. You don't have to eat every single thing exactly every day, but like, we know that that is enough calories for you. It's enough protein. It's enough healthy fats. It's enough of everything. And in a perfect world, what your body really needs is that nutrition plan. But let's be real, like, we're not going to hit the bullseye every day. And that shouldn't be the goal. It should just be your framework that you kind of try to, live in. But ultimately, it's for freedom. And the thing that when I started to kind of allow myself to do that, what I found was the irony of like, well, when I get closer to the bullseye, I actually feel better. I sleep better. I have more energy. I have like no cravings. And so I still kind of live in that space today of like, I can't get like in my mind, like I have to do this perfectly, which I never do, but I have to, I have to live in it loosely, because if I go too far off the nutrition plan, then I'm out in the woods. But if I try too hard to hit the bullseye, then I'm also kind of hindering my recovery.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's that balance, the flexibility and allowing imperfection and just making it work for you. That's amazing.
So often we are trying to grab onto something from the outside, right? Like, what's the nutrition plan that's going to fix me? What's the workout that's going to fix me? Mindset is like everything to me, because although those things are so important, mindset is the foundation of all of it. So until you change how you think, which is what we're talking about and which is your book, nothing on the outside is going to change. We've all had that experience with white knuckling a new fitness program or a new nutrition plan, and it only lasts so long. And so you have to devote time daily to work on your mindset, to change those beliefs around. And it's like, that is 95% of where we need to be. And I think it's how you're approaching it. It's never about perfection. I always say progress, not perfection, and living life a little bit more flexible and a little bit more in balance.
I know that people would love to check out your podcast. It's called, I'll let you tell people about it.
Yeah, it's called Low Bottom High Rise, because that's pretty much my life, right? I was at such a rock bottom on so many levels. And I am obsessed with interviewing other people too. That's like, you had this really low place in your life and you found success, you've overcome it. Like, what did you do? I sought that for so long when I myself was trapped, that I still and there's nothing I like hearing more than being in conversation with people that have overcome really hard things, because there's always tools and tips and strategies that people put into place that can be shared with others. So that's really what it's about. Yeah.
I love that. I think there's such power in people telling their stories, because we're all so different, but I think we can all relate to each other and pull things from each other's stories that can help us and maybe give us a way of looking at things that we haven't before. And, that's the reason I wrote my book. That's the reason I'm doing this podcast series on the recovery stories. So I love that your podcast really focuses on that and just giving people inspiration through other people's stories.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much. I mean, I just had a gentleman on who had lost his mother in a racially charged shooting, and like, to hear his story and to hear like, how do you get to a place of forgiveness in that, and for him to be able to speak through his story and his experience. And then of course, when you're listening to something like that, you're looking at your own life and you're thinking, and I can't forgive, my next door neighbor over something silly. Like it just gives you perspective, but it also gives you those aha moments and those shifts in your mindset that you need to be able to work through the things in your own life. Yeah.
For sure. And I'll put a link to her podcast in the show description as well. So awesome. Yeah, Moira, thank you so much for being here today. Are there any?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if there's any final thoughts that you'd like to share, for people still struggling.
Yeah. I just want to share, and it's funny because this came up when I interviewed you, but we didn't really talk in depth about your work and your, what you teach. And I'm sure anybody listening is extremely familiar with, your book and your teachings and everything. But I always go back to what Polly said about like the hill in San Francisco, right? Or let's say it's an anthill. And, this was like the aha that I had that just made complete sense when I read your book. And it's like, if you have this giant anthill and you've placed a marble on it every single day of your entire life, and it's built this deep groove in the ant pile, that every single time you place that marble at the top, every single time, no matter how much willpower you have, that marble's going to go down that groove. Like that's how we're wiring our brain. And when we bring intention to it, right? When we do the work that you teach in your book, we place that marble at the top and one day it actually goes in the other direction, right? And we don't binge. And it's like this huge success. But what people don't understand is still 9 times out of 10, you put the marble back, it's still going to go down the deeper groove. And so many people throw in the towel at that moment and they think, well, this didn't work for me. Like, this is not going to be the solution for me. But what I understood with that visual is, first of all, if you revert back to the old behavior, no big deal. Like, just try it again. Just keep going. Because once you can build that neural pathway of not binging and being in recovery, like that's going to supersede the old one. But it's not about crossing this threshold of, I read Kathryn's book and I'm instantaneously recovered and I never binged again. I just want that message to be there, because if the behavior comes back up, completely normal, right? It's not like you've lost progress. You just have to keep going.
Yeah, it takes that time and practice to get momentum in the direction that you want to go. And for those old pathways to, like on the anthill, for that pathway to fill in, for it to go away. So yeah, thank you. That piece of advice was very helpful, as was the entire interview. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your story.
Well, thank you for changing my entire life. Thank you for your book and thank you for your teachings and everything. I mean, I don't know where I'd be without it, honestly. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Hi, Caroline. I'm so happy you're here today.
Hi, Kathryn. It's really nice to meet you. See you in person.
Yeah, it was really great of you to share your story in the Brain Over Binge second edition. I know it takes a lot of courage to share, so I just really appreciate that. And I look forward to learning more here on the podcast today.
Great. As you know, I'm a little nervous, and I've been thinking about why that is. And one of the reasons is that this is actually the first time I've ever really shared my story to a great extent, other than in therapy. So hopefully it will come out well.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's going to help many people. And I know a lot of people can relate to that feeling of hiding and isolating and not wanting to share what you've been through. I mean, I know for me, it took a lot to put it in a book, and I'm still like, it's not my favorite topic of conversation as far as like explaining what I went through. So anyway, that was a tangent, but thank you so much. And this started at an early age for you, right?
It did. When I began the recovery process in Brain Over Binge, I was 51 years old. And up until then, I would sort of describe myself as the poster child for a life spent in diet culture. My eating disorder did begin with a diet when I was 12 years old. And prior to that, I sort of, thought that prior to reading Brain Over Binge, I should say, I kind of thought that the factors going on in my house at the time might have been to blame. And I was going through puberty and all this other stuff. But then, after reading your book, I got clarity that no, it was in fact the diet I went on when I was 12. And I can remember like it was yesterday when I made that decision to go on a diet. My memories of my childhood before 12 years old were mostly happy. I was a happy kid from a pretty stable home. And I was sort of an enthusiastic eater. My mom always loved that about me, right? eat or try anything. And I was always tall for my age. And I went through puberty earlier than my friends, who actually happened to be sort of exceptionally tiny, my little teeny tiny girlfriends. And I was, developing at a different rate. And the day in 6th grade, when the school nurse lined us up and put us on the scale, was the first time I really had any awareness that I was overweight, simply because my other friends weighed significantly less than I did. I went home and I announced to my mother that I was going on a diet. And this was 1980. So diet culture and the thin ideal were certainly, aerobics, home workouts, all that kind of thing. It was definitely in the culture, and in my own mother too. My mother struggled with her own food and weight issues, and that sort of messages I heard growing up. And so she supported it. She wasn't armed with the information that this was a bad thing. So I started a diet, and it wasn't long until I was restricting myself into full-blown anorexia. And sort of all the while at home being encouraged by my parents. I mean, I even remember my father saying, that he envied my willpower and things like this. I was getting no messages that this was, a bad thing. And I lost my period. My period probably had only started about 3, 4, 5 months before I started this diet. And along with my period, I just, I kind of lost my spark for life. But like I said, sort of all the while being supported at home and slipping under the radar screen of my parents. My mother, actually, I loved her dearly. She did her best, but she just simply was in over her head with this. She didn't understand it. It's nothing she would have ever helped me seek help for. It was a private matter to be handled by the family. It was really sort of brought to her awareness by a family friend that we were visiting for a summer vacation. We were at their home, and this friend who hadn't seen me for a long time remarked to my mom right when she saw me that this isn't right. This child is 13. She should be developing and gaining weight. And I was this tiny little, shell of a person. It's sort of like living under my parents' roof. They were just maybe too close to the problem to be aware that it was getting completely out of hand. So my mom sort of fumbled her way through a confrontation with me that the dieting, I needed to try to stop dieting. And because I didn't want to disappoint her, and also, too, a part of me was probably relieved, right? Like someone had found out or whatever and was, wanting to help me out of this miserable existence that I had created for myself. So I tried to do what she said. And when I tried to start eating more, still, absolutely terrified, monitoring so closely the number on the scale and all that, still trying to start eating like a normal kid again. And it very quickly just spiraled straight into bulimia. I know that's not unusual, right? Like I went from anorexia straight into binging and true purging. For me, it was throwing up. And that cycle, I remained in bulimia until through college. But it was, for me, like binging and purging was kind of in the mix of the other like diet bags of tricks I had. If I would go on a restrictive diet, then when I came out of it, when my body sort of rebelled against it, I would go back to the binging and purging. So unlike you, it wasn't, once I latched onto binging, it did not continue completely as my main eating disorder. It just was in the mix of my overall diet pattern of sort of abusive behavior. And I would have to say that if there was one thing that my brain sort of fixed on as an addiction, it was dieting. Like a diet was the answer to everything. It was sort of my brain's safe space, right? It became like that survival instinct trigger. When life got crazy, go on a diet. Like when I was confronted with any sort of, challenge, it was always just, let's ramp it up. Let's go on a diet. And also too, I should mention as well that when I was anorexic, I also added habitual exercise into the mix. I was very young, so I kind of had these weird, strange ways of like getting exercise into my day, putting on a record and running in place in the living room or, doing 100 sit-ups, very ritualistic, again, completely going unnoticed by my parents. So, when I was being good and restrictive, I was, eating perfectly, exercising perfectly, and just, holding on to control. Like there was no tomorrow. So that I would say is what my brain latched onto was restrictive dieting. And then just the cycle of restrict and indulgent. That was my life for all through college and then into my young adult life. I moved away from home and I did at that period of my life experience a little bit of relief from the pattern. Like I will add that I did lose weight before I moved away from home. And so when I was living independently, I did have a period where I was sort of for the first time living eating disorder free. Mm-hmm. But because I had never been treated. I mean, that's important to keep in mind. I had no therapy, no help, no one guiding me or even, causing me to think differently about this. It really was just me fumbling along, suffering in silence until I did hit this one stretch of reprieve from the cycle. But then again, since it had never been treated, it was still back there and it just sprung back into the forefront. And I started it became part of my life again shortly after I got my first real job. And I would say then, that continued on through my marriage, having my children. And by middle age, I know that my body was just, I was exhausted from it. It was like entering that phase where it was harder and harder to ramp up the willpower and crank down on myself again. And I did sort of settle into binging as a go-to disorder without purging by my early 40s, I guess, maybe. And that, as you can imagine, then my weight gain cycled a lot quicker. And I guess I should mention, I haven't that I was never an overweight person, but with my dieting and buying into the thin ideal and diet culture, mm-hmm. I only liked my body when it was 10 to 15 pounds lighter than it should be. So I really had very messed up body image issues because that was an unmaintainable weight for me. Mm-hmm. So that, self-hatred that would come with not being able to maintain this weight and, really only liking myself, my image in the mirror when I was underweight was super ingrained. And so the body image issues were, right there along with everything else for the entire time. But yes, by the time I was in my early to mid 40s, I'd sort of no longer had the energy, quite frankly, to purge or do anything on the other side of the binge. So I would, have periods of being out of control every now and then, channeling, mustering the willpower to go on another diet.
Yeah, it seems like the dieting was, even when you found my book, it seemed like you had this thought oh, but I need to go on a diet first to lose the weight. And it just seemed like that was the hardest thing to let go.
Absolutely. Throughout my struggles, my years and years, decades of struggle, the one thing that I did do was I was always very curious about it. I think that you put in your book too, that you would read, obviously you read because that's what led you to the Jack Trimpey book, but I did too. And with hindsight, it's funny. I was reading mostly the wrong books, I quit sugar or, eat fat, get thin. I still, my reading was still more geared to finding the perfect diet, figuring out the perfect way to eat that was suddenly going to make this struggle go away and maintain my skinny weight effortlessly and et cetera, et cetera. But somewhere along the way, I read a book by Janine Roth, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Yes. She sort of was an early pioneer in what is now intuitive eating, but really reading her book tapped more into the emotional eating concept. Again, I was completely unaware of that. And that, the idea that how and when and where you eat is more important or at least a part of the puzzle as, what you eat. It's not all about the food. And so that slipped in there somewhere, which kind of got me thinking a little bit about this whole issue differently. And then when I found Brain Over Binge, I must admit, because I wasn't in the moment, in a cycle of binge and purge, I read it. It was fascinating. It was the first book that ever brought the brain component into the equation. But I still, I think, as I shared in the book, had this is too easy. I can't simply stop. I got to shed that 30 pounds. Then I'll circle back and I'll maintain my weight this way. It wasn't clicking that, this was going to get me where I wanted to go long-term. I was still too fixated on, I'm not at my low weight, yeah. And so I'm going to table this and come back to it. So, on I went looking for other diets and not succeeding and living in hell. And just, the cycle was continuing. And then I do remember, just like I remember when I started my first diet, when my brain switched over into this has got to stop. I was on a trip to New York City with my girlfriends, and we'd spent the morning shopping. And I was in one of my, I'm fat, I'm ugly, I'm gross, I don't want to try any clothes moods. And so I wasn't, I was kind of sitting on the side observing and just in a, general funk about all of it. And we went to lunch and we're sitting at the restaurant and I'm looking around. It's like my great friends were on this fun girls weekend, menu in front of me. And, my mind just spinning like out of control. Like I want to eat this, but I'm going to choose this. I should have that, but I can't exercise tomorrow morning. So, better go with this. And literally, my brain just said enough. Like this is no way to live. Right. Because by then, I was 51. I just turned 51. Actually, it was my birthday trip. And maybe there was something about that resonated, right? Like this can't go on. And so I ordered what I wanted, enjoyed it. And I went home and I reread your book. And the second reading for me just changed everything. Suddenly it was just, it was all making sense. I will say the one thing too, the main thing about my second reading of the book that didn't click with me the first time was the addiction voice recognition technique. Like I went to town with that. I somehow missed it the first time, but when I read it again, I kind of just went all in. It was helpful to me in resisting urges to binge or emotional eat. And I printed an image of the brain. I labeled the beast brain. I labeled that. I gave her a voice and an identity. I named my addiction voice Trixie. And I put Trixie, and in my mind, Trixie looked like Belle, the Disney princess with the head of the beast. And then Caroline was in the big brain and a picture of me. And I literally used that image to, coach my way out of my urges. And I also too, I extended Trixie's voice to anything that had to do with basically diet culture. Like a perfect example would be, if Trixie was telling me to get on the scale, just check how much you weigh, just see if you're losing weight. Like I would do the opposite. I threw out my scale. Right. And so that's how I kind of used the addiction voice in my process on my second reading, which ended up being very successful for me.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a great visual, and I think people will appreciate that and maybe think of something that may apply to them or resonate with them about how to visualize that voice. Because when you really see it as something that's not you, no matter what you call it, it just gives you so much power over it. So yeah, I think that's amazing. Having dieted since you were 12 years old to finally get to the point to say, okay, this is not working anymore. But just because you know it's not working, it's not helping you, it's ruining your life, it doesn't mean that voice is going to go away. So you need tools to recognize that voice and not follow it and to decondition all those habits. And yeah, it's just super inspiring that you were able to do that.
And it was nerve-wracking for me just because I didn't, Cookie talks about this idea of wanting to lose the problem more than lose the weight. And I do think that's critical. And that really resonated when I was just enough, I can't do this another day. I really did. I was ready to take that leap of faith that somehow by, putting end to the problem, just this preoccupation, years-long preoccupation with food and diet and weight and body image stuff, that did trump, wanting to be my low weight on the scale. And I just put trust in the fact that it was, going to land me somewhere in the middle, probably that felt right. And that would end the problem.
Yeah. And that in a weight that works for your own body and that's sustainable. And it's not you trying to fight your own physiology. I would like to talk about that a little, because I think people who think, okay, it's my job to control my weight and I have to do all these things to control it, to let go and to allow the body to find its own weight is a hard thing. And I think a lot of people think that when you let go, your weight's going to spiral out of control, when obviously that did not happen for you. You mentioned that you lost weight naturally and you're at your weight that works for your own body. So maybe talk about that process and how you were able to let go and just trust your body.
That was probably the single biggest challenge. And I did have to do things like get rid of my scale. But I will also say that I kind of regretted putting that weight loss piece in the little bio that I wrote for the book, because that very, very quickly fell away. Like that, when I saw that my body was sort of dropping weight naturally, but even more so that, that my brain was letting go of the need to do it, losing weight was very, very secondary. But I did really feel that to conquer my cravings and be free from food, like what I really wanted to do, what we all want to do, is just to be able to eat naturally, meaning you can be around food without feeling the need to consume it, right? And so even though it was difficult, like I kind of went against my instincts a lot, I had children, so I didn't hesitate to fill up the pantry with junk food and just practice